This presentation is going to consider the role of community surveys as a way of measuring subjective elements of community indicators. We can begin by noting that most surveys that are carried out are national in focus, and national level survey data does not allow for the analysis of local conditions, either within or between communities. And to some extent, this grows out of a view that only the entire society, the mass society, is what matters, and that local conditions are irrelevant, which is a bias we see carried out in a lot of research. So absent from our understanding is how perceptions vary within and between communities. And it's an important question to think about. And it's going to be important for planning, evaluation, and so forth, which we discuss in our presentation on community indicators. And so what we're going to focus largely on here is the actual mechanics of survey design, as that's a key part of coming up with good community surveys. So community surveys, as we said earlier, provide subjective data, and they help identify the needs of a community as reported by residents, if that's your sample, or of elected officials, if that's your sample. Help to gauge perceptions of local agencies or institutions. So you might talk to people who are affiliated with the local university or the local social service office. You need to identify levels of support for plans or development efforts. What kind of financial backing, what kind of social support is there to get behind different development ideas. Helps pinpoint community satisfaction levels. Do people like where they live? What do they like about their community? What do they dislike? And it helps to track response to disaster or other types of community shocks. So if a large employer leaves, or if there's a hurricane or a flood, by engaging in community survey research, we can take baseline and benchmark measurements over time. And there's more than one way to administer a survey, and probably the most effective, unfortunately, is also the most expensive, and that's face-to-face, where you actually maybe knock on doors and ask people questions in person, because you get a high response rate. And you also get a great deal of opportunity to explain the questions so that the people who are taking the survey are not confused. And if they have questions, they can just ask the person giving the interview. The next best way may be through the mail. It is cheaper that way, believe it or not. The response rate tends to be lower, and there's no ability for people to ask questions. So if they're confused, they're just kind of stuck with that confusion. Some view telephone administration as a happy medium. In terms of on the phone, you can clarify questions. The response rate's a little better than mail, but not quite as good as face-to-face. And the cost is also somewhere in between. Now, the absolute cheapest also provides the lowest possible response rate and an inability to provide clarification on questions, and that's the internet. And that's grown in popularity because of how easy it is to put a questionnaire online and to start collecting responses. But as we'll see, that's not necessarily the best way to go. So this table is taken out of the Lyon and Driscoll text, and it provides a comparison of all of these modes of administration on a number of items. So we begin with face-to-face. We see that the cost, this is the worst in terms of cost, in terms of turnaround time. It's very lengthy. It takes a long time for it to happen. It's the best, however, when it comes to response rate and the ability to probe, which means to ask follow-up questions. It allows you to ask complex questions because you have the ability to clarify what is meant. And there's some ability, it's not the best, to use visual aids. In fact, some surveys rely on visual aids extensively. And the ability to allow respondents to seek additional data, that's not really useful with face-to-face. Now, if you've ever noticed, when you take like an online survey, a lot of times when you're done, you can see how other people responded, and you get no such kind of thing with face-to-face. If you have a lengthy questionnaire, it is certainly best to deliver that in person, and then next best would be through the web, followed by the phone and then mail. Mail is probably the worst when you have a lengthy questionnaire. In terms of assurance that desired respondent completes the questionnaire, well, face-to-face wins on that, followed by telephone, web, and mail. The ability to monitor the interview process is the highest with the telephone, followed by mail, web, and the worst is face-to-face, because you don't really have a lot of oversight over the interviewers. And in terms of representative sampling frames, the telephone has a system called random digit dialing, which makes it the best for generating random samples, but we can also come up with other ways of getting random samples that are used with face-to-face and mail surveys, and probably the worst are web-based surveys, which generally have little control over who's actually taking the survey. Now, keeping all those criteria in mind that essentially assess the quality of a particular mode of administration, we can also think about ways to improve the quality of our surveys by focusing on questionnaire design. And one of the things that people have found who study this particular topic is that when people say no to a survey, that is, you're going to increase your non-response rate, which is something you want to avoid if you can, that it's important to begin a questionnaire with interesting and engaging questions that set the hook, so to speak. It's also important that the person giving the interview provide full information about who they are, who they're with, in terms of affiliation, what kind of topics will be covered on the survey, why the people have been chosen to be in the survey. And then sometimes there are screening questions. Maybe you only want to talk to women because this survey is about women's issues. So if you get a male, then through the screening process, you'll thank them for their time and then hang up the phone or leave, whatever the mode of administration is. And then finally, an assurance of confidentiality has to be given, and that means assuring people that you're not going to advertise the way they respond. And all this also taken from the Lyon and Driscoll text. And when I teach a class on social research methods, I always have fun saying that the only time you'll ever hear a professor encourage you to commit plagiarism is if you are designing a questionnaire, because it's actually a really good idea to use questions off of old survey questionnaires verbatim, because the slightest change of words or word order can create a different understanding of questions. So in order to be consistent and to facilitate comparisons across questionnaires, we want to stick with the exact same question. And that there are some exceptions to that, and that is if a question is really bad and we don't want to use it again. So what are the characteristics of good questions? We want to be as simple as we can. We don't want to try to package too many ideas into a single question. We want to use clear and straightforward language that's accessible to our intended sample. And our intended sample might be experts, in which case we can ask more complicated questions. But if it's the general public, we want to avoid jargon and special knowledge questions. We don't want to have double barrels or double negatives, right? Which also can confuse people. We don't want to lead with any kind of charged items, such as it's interesting, if you ask people if they like and support welfare, usually they say no, but if you ask them if they like programs that support the poor, they tend to say yes to that. So just the term welfare is a charged concept. And finally, we want to limit open-ended questions, because once the survey is complete, it's very difficult to analyze the results of open-ended questions, and much more straightforward using statistical techniques to analyze closed-ended questions, because we can quantify that. And as we continue to think about questionnaire design, it's also important to think about how you are grouping your questions together. And generally, as we said, we want the first question, and in fact probably first batch of questions, to be highly related to the general topic, to be very engaging and interesting. We want closed-ended easy to answer. We don't want people struggling in the beginning. We want it to be very enjoyable for them if it's possible. And then as we go through the questionnaire, we want all the items to be grouped together by topic. And usually those topics are subparts of the larger issue we're trying to address. If we do have harder questions, we don't want to start with them, but they should come early in the experience. We don't want to, as people take lengthy questionnaires, they become fatigued towards the end, and you don't want to start burdening them with difficult questions at that time. Sensitive questions, however, people are more likely to answer them honestly if they come last, and that's why when you take a survey, you often get demographic questions that ask about your personal characteristics at the end, such as your age, your political beliefs, and all those kinds of things. And, as we move from one topic area to the next, we want to have clear and useful transition statements so it doesn't feel like it's out of the blue and people can kind of keep up with the flow of the conversation. We also want to think about the length of the questionnaire and the total amount of time it takes to complete the survey, and we really want to keep the range between 10 and 30 minutes. Anything longer than that is a burden, and it's not a bad idea as things become more burdensome to increase the reward, and it is encouraged actually to use some kind of financial reward to incentivize the survey, and that has actually been shown to improve response rates. And remember, we want to leave a good impression because a lot of research winds up being longitudinal, and any hope of speaking with the same person in the future is going to depend on the experience of the first interview. And of course, if that's a bad experience, it's going to be really hard to get them another time in the future. It's also important to consider the role of pretesting. Once you design a questionnaire, it's a really good idea to try it out on people before the survey goes live. And that means you'll have the opportunity to notice mistakes or problems in terms of the wording of questions or in the order of the questions, and be able to fix those things before it's too late. So pretesting is absolutely essential to any kind of survey research. So beyond concern with questionnaire design, when we conduct a survey, another important element is sampling. Who's going to be in the survey? Who are we going to involve in the interviews? And we really need to decide up front if the goal of our survey is to generate generalizable results. And if that's the case, then we need to come up with a representative sample. And a representative sample is basically a cross-section of the wider population that we're studying. And to get that, we usually have to use some kind of random selection process, such as simple random sampling or systematic random sampling. We mentioned earlier with telephones, they can randomly dial numbers, which creates a random sample. And we can also use directories as sampling frames, but that's becoming less reliable as mobile phones have come to replace traditional landlines. And finally, we also have to think about the size of our sample, because that's going to be related to how much sampling error there is. And generally, the larger the sample, the better. It's going to be a closer reflection of the actual population. When it comes to the business of actually administering the survey, there are a lot of details to keep in mind, such as coming up with a system for scheduling interviews. And if people want to reschedule, being able to accommodate that through callbacks or comebacks, whether we're talking about phone or face-to-face. And a system of keeping records of vacancies, right? It's people that you need to follow up with, so to speak. And we need to train interviewers, people who are going to be giving the questionnaire. We have to train them to sort of stick to the script or whatever the case may be. And we need to monitor the interviews to ensure quality. With telephones, that's usually pretty straightforward and easy. It's not so easy with face-to-face. And we need to code the responses, and that involves a whole additional step of data entry. And of course, if you're doing a web-based survey, that is one of the big advantages. The data are automatically entered into a spreadsheet. And that is not the case with the other modes of administration that we discussed. And finally, once everything is in a spreadsheet of some kind, we're able to analyze the results. And We can bring that spreadsheet into a program that is suited to the kind of analysis we're going to do. Excel is great if what you want to do is generate descriptive analysis, where we look at percentages, we look at central tendency, such as averages or variability, make nice graphs and charts in Excel. Or we may need something a little more powerful in terms of statistical analysis, such as SPSS or SAS or Stata or R. All of those are statistical programs, and they allow us to do modeling, right? So modeling is an important part of social science. Doing such things as correlation analysis or regression allows us to build predictive models, and that's a major advantage of these statistical packages. And that will conclude our discussion of community surveys.